Hello, I'm Rhonda Farragher and I'm the Director of the Down Syndrome Research Program here at the University of Queensland. And researchers here have been working for over 40 years studying issues and problems of relevance to people with Down syndrome and their families. As we record this, it's Down Syndrome Awareness Month, and it's always a great time to look back and look to the future and think about things that matter for people with Down syndrome. We're delighted to welcome our distinguished panel presenters today, each of whom has worked tirelessly to improve the lives of people with Down syndrome and to foster greater understanding of living with disability. Our first panel discussion focuses on the early days of Down syndrome Queensland. Barrett Nelson has served as a minister in Queensland Parliament and was instrumental in the establishment of the Down Syndrome Association in Queensland in 1976 and then in New South Wales and Victoria. After a long and storied career, Barrett remains a passionate advocate. Dr. Anne Jobling has been involved with UQ's Down Syndrome Research Program since its establishment over 40 years ago. The longitudinal study within the DSRP is the longest running study of its kind in the world. Anne, though retired, continues to research with the DSRP team that continues its work with our participants with Down syndrome. I'd like to introduce our panel moderator, Ruth Farragher. Ruth completed secondary school at Indooroopilly High and graduated from TAFE Queensland. She's now working full-time in the early childhood education sector. So, over to you, Ruth.
Barrett, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection with Down syndrome?
Well, I'm just an ordinary woman, born in Queensland and raised in the city and the country, and studied radiography, got married, had a child and went to live in Sydney, had another child, and no questions were raised at the time in Sydney. But when we got back to Brisbane, which was several months later, I realised that there may be some things we needed to discuss, and went to see our GP, who said that our son had Down syndrome. It wasn't quite what he said, but that's what he meant. And so my husband and I at the time got very involved very quickly in something we knew nothing about. So we worked quite hard to find organisations that might help us. Found that there were a couple around that were helpful but not appropriate. And so over the next 4 years we worked towards getting an organisation that would represent the needs of people with Down syndrome.
Anne, can you tell us about yourself and your connection with Down syndrome?
I certainly can. I came to Queensland from South Australia, having been brought up in Melbourne. And when I was in South Australia, I worked as a physical educator with youngsters with intellectual disability, and I found I really enjoyed my time working with young people with intellectual disability. So when I came to Queensland, I was looking for an area of work in physical education for young people with intellectual disability, and I found there wasn't anything. However, very fortunately, the University of Queensland here in the Fred and Eleanor Chanel Special Education Research Centre had just started in 1978 a program of research that would take us to the current day. And I came to work on that program for 2 hours a week, nursing babies, helping mothers and babies look at books, and gradually the program gave me more hours of work, and we started to look at the ongoing development of youngsters with Down syndrome, from babies through to preschool, schooling, and now a lot of those babies are taller and bigger than I am as they go into the big wide world.
Barrett, thinking back to the 1970s, what was it like to have a child with Down syndrome at the time?
It was somewhat lonely. There were not the support services that exist today for either the parents or for the child. There weren't the educational opportunities available, any of the early intervention programs, and there was a lot of misunderstandings about people with Down syndrome as well. And so it was a fairly tough going for a few years. Our son had a lot of health problems as well, so it took a while for that to move along. But what happened was a group of public servants started to get parents together and started talking to us about helping each other, and we got to know a group of families, and we all became, I suppose, agitators and protesters in a nice, polite way, but we were certainly protesters. And we formed a little committee, and decided that we would form the Down Syndrome Association in Queensland, and did that in 1976. But it was pretty lonely. Yeah, it was hard work, but it was also a challenge.
And you were involved from the start of the Down syndrome research program in 1978. What was it like being involved with families across those years? Can you recall the motivation for this research to begin?
I can indeed do that. And when you ask me what it was like to be involved, it was very challenging to be involved, but it was a wonderful privilege to work with the families, because our research initially was looking at and being involved with the families as they tried to understand the development of their youngster. As Barrett has already said, it was a pretty lonely situation because there wasn't much information, and the information that was available to parents, to mums and dads, was particularly negative. It was all of the things they can't do. And our research unpacked the development of young children with Down syndrome through early intervention, and that was just wonderful. That was both challenging and motivating to all of us. And there were a whole group of us involved. I'm not the only one. So we had a wonderful person initially with mothers and babies called Coralie Price, and she had a daughter with Down syndrome. So she gave us lots of encouragement, because I don't have a child with an intellectual disability. So it was important for us to take on board some of the feelings and some of the loneliness, etc., that the parents and families were feeling. And we were on their side. If you sort of look at an advocate, we were on their side. But we were also very focused on finding the developmental milestones across a range of their mental capacity, their motor capacity, temperamental aspects, and families with siblings and children with Down syndrome, their interactions. So they were the four big areas. But what a wonderful thing to be involved in over all this time. In fact, I can get quite emotional about the families and the involvement with those families. So thank you, Down syndrome.
I would like to ask you both to briefly reflect on your advocacy work throughout your careers. Can you tell us a little about key changes that you have fought for?
Well, it could take longer than the 2 minutes, but we'll see. Firstly, we decided that we needed to get some changes in the wording used, the language that was used to speak about people with intellectual disability and Down syndrome in particular. Our first president was a lovely man called Guilfis Gasola, and I became the unofficial public relations officer for the group. So we started talking to the media, we started talking to politicians. We all decided we'd get involved in politics to a party that suited our beliefs or values, and several of us ended up getting elected to Parliament, which made things much easier to get things changed. And I must pay tribute here to a man called Dr. Lou Edwards, who died recently, who was Treasurer and Deputy Premier of this state, who helped me to get elected and also helped to implement a lot of the programs that were put in place in the late 70s and early 80s, and well, right through the 80s actually. But some of the things were really early intervention programs.
He was very helpful.
He was, yes.
Very, very forceful.
He was, yes, he was terrific, yes.
And helpful with the development of the early intervention.
And
yes.
he actually got a bit of help from our organisation about
well
that. We were, I think you could say we would be out there with Extinction Rebellion. If it was happening today, we were pretty powerful advocates, and Gulfi Scasola was a barrister,
yes,
a solicitor and barrister, and a lot of us had professional backgrounds, and one of the families, he was a famous football player, and so there were a lot of people with, I suppose you'd say, influence of some sort, and we used it as much as we could. And we worked with the public servants, the senior public servants, and got them on board. Sometimes that was the hardest part.
So they had a lot of preconceived
Yes,
ideas,
yeah. Either that or they had no idea at all. But they were terrific. In the end, they became great supporters of early intervention, preschool, mainstreaming. But one of the other things that I wanted to see too was independent living. And we got that in place in the late... But Lou was really great in helping me with that as well. So I think we were tremendously successful at a period of a lot of change in Australia. The 80s was a change in many ways, and I mean, when I got elected there were 2 women in the Parliament and I was one of them.
That's
so
wonderful.
Yeah, 2 out of 89. So times have certainly changed.
But that's
so,
sort of where Lou too was great.
Oh, he was great. Yes.
With women.
Yeah. Oh, he was wonderful.
Many of the researchers here on Down syndrome were women.
Yes.
So
yeah, he was
mothers,
wonderful.
yes,
he was
so
a lovely, lovely human being,
absolutely.
But also he was a doctor.
Yeah.
He was a doctor based in Ipswich, and his personal experience was that when a parent had to go into hospital, a mother in particular, he and his wife would take the child into their family and look after that child for the whole time that parent was in hospital and recovering. So he got a lot of personal knowledge as well as his medical experience. He got a lot of personal knowledge as well. So yeah, it was just, have to really pay a big tribute to him. Yeah. And to Gulfi, who died some years ago as well, and he was quite a powerful voice. But we were really, and it wasn't party political. There were people on various. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was a good time, and I think it achieved a lot of really positive outcomes. Yes.
That group was really quite helpful for the longitudinal study in the sense that we were enabled with the information from the longitudinal study to advocate for the 4 first early intervention preschools, the one at Acacia Ridge, the one at Aspley, the one at...
I'll tell you how we got that one day.
Geebung, yeah. And one of the great privileges we had here as researchers is that under the guidance of Dr. Alan Hayes, we did a evaluation of those 4 preschools. There was one at Geebung as well, and near Milton somewhere. I pass the state school every day, but I can't think of its name. But I mean, and that was a great privilege for us because we could work with both the professionals who... This was a school of education, so we were training the professionals and the families. So that pilot program was fantastic.
Do you know how we got that?
I'd love to hear.
Well, Lou supported it, right? Well, philosophically, we took the Director General to lunch at Brisbane's best restaurant, 5 of us. We did. And we explained to him this is what was required, that we needed it. And he said, but we didn't have the buildings. And I said, I explained where they were and that you did have the facilities, and that because they'd overbuilt with some other project, and that they hadn't funded all the preschools, so there were these 4 that were available. And there were actually a couple more in other parts of Queensland as well, which were later used, I believe.
Yes, well, the one at Emerald, I went up with the as a representative of the Down Syndrome Association of Queensland, up to Emerald for a week to work with those preschool teachers.
Yes,
And
they were just, I mean, so really coming back, it was quite funny because I don't think that particular man had much understanding before the lunch, but he had quite a lot after the lunch. And he was really great. And it was only a matter of weeks after that that they had the budget set aside for the training and the whole thing. And once he knew they had the facilities, because I think he really didn't seem quite aware that they had spare facilities, but once he became aware that there were facilities, that they didn't have to do new infrastructure, he was, I think, quite happy to cough up with the money for the training and the staff.
Yeah, well, Chanel had also done a big, under Betty Watts, we'd done a Australia-wide look at early intervention.
Yes, that's where we'd got the information.
So we used that as a draw card for us. You know, we have the expertise, we have this longitudinal study, we were already publishing papers on developmental milestones and the importance of lifting the expectations and covering the health issues as they arose. So it was so timely that you took the minister to lunch.
It was funny, yes. When I look back, it was quite amusing, but productive. But the other thing was that we had a fellow in our group who also and a couple. I think her name was Meredith and his name was Trevor Sauer. He was a doctor as well, but they had a Down syndrome daughter with Down syndrome, and he played an active role in terms of some of that, making us aware of a lot of that information as well. So it was a very productive time.
Well, those two reports are really excellent and still have the groundwork for early intervention.
Yes.
Looking back at these times, what role do you think that research has played in helping to create change?
An absolutely critical role. It was, if without the good information that was being developed, I don't think we would have ever been able to get the public service and many other politicians to accept what was happening. You know, I mentioned Extinction Rebellion and climate change before, but it was a little bit like that in terms of getting the facts in front of people and getting them to really get a better understanding of the situation. And just getting words changed in legislation to begin with, and then getting programs developed. Without the research, I don't think a lot of that would have happened. It certainly wouldn't have happened. It was just timing, wasn't it, Anne? It was critical because everything came together beautifully over that 5 to 10 years. It was just wonderful.
And the one thing for us that with this great partnership really with parents that the longitudinal study developed over the years and continues to develop is that we can work together in this task of raising expectations, pushing education beyond grade 12, beyond this notion that once you get to about grade 10 you go into life skills.
And that's just not the case. I read just, I've got a bit of a mad Facebook page, as one young woman in Australia has a degree, and there's another young man looking at a photographic media studies degree, and I think there's going to be more and more of that. The other thing that I was very happy to see emerge, probably in the late 90s and into the 2000s, was the visual arts and the film industry, to see more and more people. And I just love it. I get a kick out of it every time. But that's played a valuable role in changing community attitudes and getting a better understanding.
You know, we must remember that Down syndrome crosses a whole range of abilities and disabilities. Yes. And some young people have health problems that are really difficult for them to overcome.
My son did.
Thank goodness for the medical profession that has changed. Yes. But anyway, lots of wonderful stories. Yeah. Lots of wonderful stories.
Gosh, Thinking back.
What a privilege, eh? What a privilege.